Orcs are probably the most consistent and oldest staple of grunt-like villain of the fantasy setting since the very inception of the genre, arguably beginning with Tolkien. Tolkien himself had stated that he drew upon Old English sources, specifically the word Orkneas. To quote him, "I originally took the word from Old English orc. This is supposed not to be connected with modern English orc, a name applied to various sea beasts of the dolphin order." Tolkien defined the notion of the orc for modernity forevermore in terms of its appearance, its habits, and above all, in terms of disposition. Grayish green and yellow-skinned brutes whose sole purpose is to seemingly destroy and despoil, and it is from this inheritance that the orc in D&D, beginning in the 1970s, takes its inspiration. But this begs the question, where are the orcs in Baldur's Gate 3? Both Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 had orcs as enemies in the game, even if their role was not large, and thus we are forced to ask this question as to where they are in the third title. Thus far, we've encountered a fair number of similar such creatures, namely goblinoids, such as goblins, hobgoblins, and bugbears, as well as gnolls and ogres, but orcs remain curiously absent. Why is this? Especially when considering the fact that we will almost certainly be receiving the half-orc as a playable race, as this too begs the rather obvious question, where do half-orcs come from? It stands to reason that given the soon-to-be presence of half-orcs, that there will also be fully fledged orcs in the game, as opponents at the very least. However, traditionally, orcs are low-level enemies, and depending on how leveling is reworked and done upon full release, the level threshold could very well have been exceeded by the time we emerge from the Underdark. And we already have multiple encounters with similar types of enemies, such as goblins, hobgoblins, bugbears, and ogres. So it could be that orcs will simply be absent from the game. That said, orcs are a perennial staple of Dungeons & Dragons, and it would therefore behoove us all to explore the nature of orcs, just in case we do in fact end up encountering them. The life of an orc is short, brutish, and ridden by conflict and violence, reaching adulthood between the ages of 11 and 14, and rarely, if ever, living past the age of 40, and more frequently perishing far earlier than that due to battle and war. Orcs are typically slightly shorter than humans, but far stockier and heavier, as well as much more muscular on average. They are, in some sense, the quintessential warrior, or at the very least, look the part. The ultimate origin of the orcs is not known, but legends surrounding them date back to the earliest of times. Indeed, the principal and best-known legend tells us of the first conflict between the elves and the orcs, when Corellin Larethian fought and defeated Gruumsh One-Eye by cutting out his eye with his magical longsword, driving him away from elven lands. Of course, the orcs tell a different tale, claiming Gruumsh has always only had one eye. But whatever the ultimate truth of the story, it tells us much about the nature of the orcs, who are, almost to an individual, bellicose, bloodthirsty, and aggressive, inspired by their chief deity Gruumsh, who relentlessly drives them to war and conquest. The first actual documentation of orcs on Toril occurred early in Toril's history, when the so-called creator races constructed a portal to a different world, in a region referred to as the Spine of the World, deep within its mountain range. And these were the first orcs to come through to Toril en masse, flooding the land. Orcs since this time have been a periodic yet constant threat to the civilized races of Toril, having become arch-enemies to the elves, dwarves, and other demi-humans during this time, as well as humans on more than one occasion. Orcish fecundity and ferocity are the keys to their success, and why they represent such a threat to civilization. Their high reproductive rate ensures that there is a constant flow of new warriors, ready to storm the lands when there is a sufficiently strong leader in place to drive them to do so. One such leader, for example, was an orcish king called Obold Many Arrows, a powerful orc leader that had been blessed directly by the god Gruumsh, and later officially founded, in most unusual fashion, an orcish kingdom that coexisted peacefully alongside humans and demi-human settlements for generations. But this is a grand exception to the rule, as typically orcs are not peace-seeking, nor do they tend to establish organized kingdoms, as orcish society is constantly riven by internal strife and rivalry, deeply chaotic, and amazingly unstable. And this attitude and psychology, it can be argued, is an inheritance of their gods, with their chief god Gruumsh leading the other orcish gods. Unlike the human Faerunian pantheon, which is a mix of profoundly evil and good deities, as well as middle-of-the-road gods, and the demi-human pantheons, which are almost entirely good, with a few exceptions, Orcish deities are thoroughly evil, and a reflection of the people that the deities have created. First among them is Gruumsh One-Eye with his mighty spear, a god of conquest and war, whom all orcs and orc deities ultimately serve. Gruumsh relentlessly pushes his people to war and expand their territory, and one of the worst sins an orc can commit is failing to wage war and search for new territory to conquer. Peace is anathema to Gruumsh, as are orcs who seek said peace. It is for this reason that it is so unusual for long-term stable settlements and kingdoms to emerge, as rarely does Gruumsh tolerate such peace, which makes the founding of the Kingdom of Many Arrows, already mentioned, as well as his personal sponsorship of its king, all the more puzzling. A large part of this boils down to Gruumsh's doctrine of survival of the fittest, and principle that only the strong should survive, which he sees as the only way to promote the best warriors among the orcs, by weeding out the weak and allowing the strong to prosper. Despite his preeminent position in the orc pantheon, Gruumsh is in fact not the only god. His wife is called Luthik, and is worshipped primarily by orc females, and is the patroness of caves, healing, and witchcraft, a harsh mistress, and completely subordinate to her husband in every respect. It is her task to encourage orc females to produce as many capable warriors as possible. Gruumsh also has a son by Luthik, Baldur, who embodies pure strength and might, and is simultaneously as dumb as a rock. In addition to these gods, Ilnivil is a god of strategy and planning, and serves Gruumsh as a captain of his armies, and lends his stratagems and cunning to the warfare that orcs carry out. And beyond these gods, there are also gods far more sinister. Shargos, for example, is the god of night and shadows, as well as undeath, and is venerated by thieves and by those who dwell in darkness. And perhaps the most terrifying orcish god is Yurtrus, the god of death, disease, and decay. No other deity is as feared as he is, and it is claimed that he is always silent, as he has no physical mouth with which to speak, allowing the plagues he sends to Toril to be his mouthpiece and messenger. It is even rumored that Gruumsh fears this silent god. Given the tendencies of orcs to wage war and despoil the land, any interaction between orcs and the player characters would likely be born of hostility. I've already mentioned that based on early access, many of the traditional roles that would usually be filled by orcs have been taken over by goblinoids and ogres. This does not mean, however, that it is impossible for us to encounter orcs during the course of the game. Indeed, early access is just that, early access, and whatever build of Chapter 1 we are playing is not necessarily indicative of the final build of said chapter, much less the entire game. Larian, in fact, has publicly stated that they want Chapter 1 to be a novel experience, even for players who have played through early access multiple times. And even if this were not the case, we do know that it is very likely that leveling will be reworked in terms of how quickly we advance. Equally possible are orc encounters at somewhat higher levels, as orcs needn't be uniformly low-level enemies, even if historically that has been their role. The Zhenturim has on occasion partnered with orcs to achieve their goals, so this too might be a possibility. Or finally, one might have to concede the very strange possibility that orcs simply are not going to show up in Baldur's Gate 3, which would be very odd indeed, considering the presence of half-orcs. In any event, it remains my hope that one of the greatest staples of fantasy remains just that, and that we get the opportunity to take out some orcs, or maybe even work with them, in much the same way we can with the goblins we've become better acquainted with in early access. As with all things, time will tell. As always, thank you for tuning in. Please leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe, as it really helps out the channel, and I'll check you out next time. Take care.